I guess tonight we're looking
We're
over.
gonna start with the ambulance service,
Oh,
and then we'll
ambulance.
yep, that's our last piece, and then we'll get to the overall.
Then I guess I would recognize Ed Walker if he's hearing me.
I just had to unmute. Thank you. All right, thank you, Roland, and other folks. I'm going to attempt here to share my screen. All right, is that shared?
Yes, it is.
It is, all right, very good. So again, folks, thank you all. So we're gonna go over tonight and review the fire department EMS budget and take a look at this. This is gonna be a two-part presentation. The first part of this presentation, I'll do sort of walk you through the factors that we have, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Leo, who really has done, again, Leo, Shannon, and my deputy chief of EMS, Matt Robley, did an enormous amount of work on this in sort of these predictions and where we're going for future years. So just a little bit of background for those folks that aren't super familiar with our ambulance service. In 1972, Peterborough started its ambulance service after state law no longer made it feasible for hearses to transport patients to the hospital. The original service was provided to the towns of Peterborough, Dublin, Francistown, Greenfield, and Hancock. Greenfield left a few years ago, but they've been replaced by Temple. So we still serve a little over 13,000 residents with our ambulance service. We also provide paramedic intercept service for Antrim, Fitzwilliam, Jaffrey Memorial Ambulance Service, Souhegan Valley, and occasionally Wilton Ambulance. And one of the things this really marks for us is over the years, we've become a regional EMS provider. We do valuable support to some of our community's largest employers, whether it's Monadnock Community Hospital as the interfacility transport service for them, or also for the care that we can provide to the residents of Rivermead, Summerhill, Scott Farrer, Pheasantwood, as well as our Robin Hill Farm facilities that we have here in town. So the service really does provide a lot for that. And beyond the services to Monadnock Community Hospital, we do some limited interfacility transfers out of other hospitals around the state. We're very fortunate that we can also support these ambulance services through mutual aid, whether it's, again, Antrim, Souhegan Valley, or Jaffrey Ringe, and provide really a backup service to them and have that. Little history, as I mentioned, we started in 1972. A few of you here may remember on the right there, we have the town's first ambulance, which was a 1973 Cadillac ambulance. In 78, the town purchased A2, and to help handle call volume. We sort of, continued along with an all-call model. In 2004, the town began staffing the station with day staff. Those personnel handled the emergency at hand. They'd either hop on the fire truck or the ambulance when the call came in. And this was really due to some of the changes in demographics in the area where it became necessary to have people in the station, as you could no longer really rely on people being able to leave their place of employment and come down and get on the fire truck and the ambulance. In 2012, we transitioned to having a second ambulance crew on duty during the day and providing formal night coverage as opposed to just having the pager go off and see who showed up. And in 2018, we added our first full-time staff really to help address the need for consistent paramedic coverage at the level that we have for our paramedic care. Our call volume and type from 2012 up to 2020. If you look at this, we've had sort of a steady increase in our ambulance service. That bottom line is the transfer service, the middle line is the 911 service, and the upper line is that total, which is a combination of those two services. The thing to keep in mind with this is our 911 service includes all of our service to Peterborough and our primary service communities of Dublin, Francistown, Hancock, Sharon, and Temple, along with any mutual aid 911 calls. It is really any kind of an emergency response that we do, and the transfers of those other calls. As you look at this, it looks pretty clear in terms of a call volume standpoint through 18, 19, and 20. But as you folks may remember, we had this little thing called COVID hit us about a year or so ago. What's really interesting in looking at our call volume, and we pulled this out. So this is fiscal 20 So it's July of 19 and the first half of fiscal 21. If you look at that area with the circle around it, there really was a significant drop in call volume, starting in March, going down through March, and covered a little bit in April, May, and June. And it really wasn't until August, September that we started to get up into, back where we had been prior to COVID. Where this is important is in a couple of aspects. One, our call volume is directly tied to our revenues. We have our income, which I'll get into in a few minutes, from the calls we do. The other thing is with the ambulance, we typically run 30 to a 90-day delay or break, if you will, gap between when we transport somebody in the ambulance and when we receive the funds. And that is due primarily to the way insurance processes the claim. So we submit that to the insurance company usually within 2 weeks. A few insurers pay right away. A lot of others go through, particularly if it's a motor vehicle accident, they go through a subrogation claim or other thing. Workers' comp may take even longer as they go through it. So the drop in service during March, April, and May impacted our income through May, June, July, and August. So expenses, like a lot of other businesses, our largest portion is our regular expenditures, is salaries, about 73% of our total expenditures, except for the increase in the benefits around our full-time staff, and we added the 5 full-time paramedics on in 2018. We've stayed relatively flat. It's a 4.7% increase average over the last 4 years. One other thing that's important is starting with Pete Troop, really getting us the ambulance service on board probably 5 years ago. We have a comprehensive capital plan, which we now use to help roll in and annualize those costs so that our contract communities are now contributing to that capital on an annual basis as opposed to the previous model, which was, hey, Peterborough bought an ambulance, let's share the cost of it. By having a real capital improvement plan for the ambulance service, we've been able to better manage those costs and better manage the flow from there. Revenue, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, our primary source of revenue is insurance reimbursements. On the transfer side, this revenue typically exceeds the allocated cost to run that portion. Our 911 service has always run at a deficit. The balance of that deficit is what is allocated across the communities that receive our services. So annually, we bill Peterborough, Sharon, Dublin, now Temple, Hancock, and Francistown for that deficit. And that allocation is done through a formula where we take 50% of the population in the community, 50% of the call volume, or their call volume, and we bring those two together to come up with that formula. And that's how we do. Insurance, from the first bullet, is really broken into 3 main areas: Medicaid, Medicare, and then other insurers or other payers. Here's a quick little example of our 5-year report of revenue versus expenses. So if you look, revenue is the blue column, the other column is our expenses. So, fiscal 18, expenses exceeded our revenue, started to exceed our revenue. Fiscal 18, although we had a decrease on there. Fiscal 19 was the year that we hired those full-time staff on board, so we had a big jump in our expenses there. 20, and then we had a significant decrease in revenue, primarily due to our lost income during those 3 months we suffered from COVID. And then 21, we're looking at projections here where, again, although we have an increase in both sides, a little bit up on the revenue side. Next series of slides that I'm going to go through were provided by Dennis Allen. Dennis is a Peterborough resident, also runs along with his wife Rebecca, Emax Medical Billing. They're a local company, the company that does our medical billing. And he put together a really good presentation for Leo, Nicole, Matt Roadley, and myself on sort of the state of ambulance reimbursements and kind of how we got to where we are and what we can expect in the future. So the quick little bullet points, which I'll get into in a minute, is Medicaid rates have remained essentially flat. Medicare has gone up slightly in the past few years. Our progressively reduce their covered amounts and the amount that they will pay. Most patients are underinsured. I think that's probably something that all of us are familiar with or aware of. And there are some legislative efforts underway that may soon impact our ability to collect our reimbursements. So Medicaid, for those of you who aren't aware, Medicaid is the nation's public health insurance program. It's for people with low income. Roughly 1 in 5 Americans are covered under Medicaid. In addition to low-income folks, it also covers people with some complex and costly medical conditions. Our average Medicaid reimbursement is about $140 per call. It talks about it being less than $200 per call. The last 10 years, these rates have increased less than 3%. And managed Medicaid tends to pay a little bit better. Those are some of the managed programs that you have within the states, the various states, but again, not a whole lot better than that, $140 per run. Medicare, a little bit better than Medicaid. Medicare is the federal health insurance program for people over 65. Medicare Part B, which is their insurance, is the portion that covers the ambulance bills. It covers ground transportation when you need to be transported to a hospital, critical access hospital, or skilled nursing facility for medically necessary services and transportation in any other vehicle could endanger your health. The reason that definition is important is we have started to see in the past few years cases where Medicaid is refusing to pay the bill, stating that the ambulance call is not necessary. That the fact that, yes, there may have been a problem, the person may have needed medical care, but they didn't have to go to the hospital in an ambulance, and they refused to pay those ambulance bills. There are also cases where there is the issue with the patient and even transfers out of the hospital where, although they're going in a transfer and the doctors believe that, yes, it's a level of care that cannot be provided in a community hospital, again, Medicare will look at it and say, well, you really didn't have to go by ambulance. A family member could have given you a ride. So we don't always get reimbursed for those calls that we make with the ambulance. Quick little graph that shows this. Again, 7 years, Medicaid payments have increased a little under 6%. Inflation over the same point has been a little over 10%. So it clearly is not keeping pace with inflation. Other payers, whether it's Blue Cross, Harvard Pilgrim, or the myriad of other insurance companies that are out there, they continue to reduce their covered amount. Back in the old days, insurance companies got a bill, they would pay it. Didn't matter if it was the hospital or from the ambulance service. That's no longer true. They continue to push more and more of the cost to patient deductibles or to co-insurance. The result is a significant drop in the amount insurance companies pay overall. This graph, which I think is probably one of the most telling, looks at the percentage of insurance, what we've received compared to what we've charged. So if you go back to 2011, we were receiving just under 50% of what we billed to insurance companies. Fast forward to 2020, we're receiving just over 35%. So for every dollar that we're billing now to an insurance company, we're receiving about 36 or 37 cents on that. Along with the reduced payments is the high deductible part and the non-covered charges. Patient responsibility is growing. We have, a lot of you are familiar with these high premium or high deductible insurance programs people have. A lot of people will take these insurance because it's what's offered to them or it's a cheaper premium, but they don't often have the money set aside to pay these bills. When these bills come in, take a motor vehicle accident if you don't have insurance or catastrophic injury or illness, what we see a lot of times is people are paying the bills as they come in. So they started with a certain level of care, we transfer them from an ADNOC to another hospital or from an ADNOC to a skilled nursing facility for long-term rehabilitation and care. They simply have run out of money prior to our bill coming in, and they're not in a position to pay these bills or able to pay these bills. A little bit with statistics here. Annual growth for healthcare costs for a family of four, through the early 2000s, we had about 10% growth. We had a 4% growth in 1 year from 18 to 19. 2013 to 2018, Health plan premiums went up 20%. Inflation went up 8%, so you look at all the rest of your costs that families have, on wages only went up 12%. So really, we have all, we felt the impact of that, what that income has been to insurers. So a couple things here. What does that mean for us in terms of our future? Medicare started a ground ambulance data collection program. So starting this past year, January of last year, January 20 through 2024, a number of ambulance services around the nation, both municipal providers like Peterborough Fire and Rescue and private ambulance companies, are being asked to participate in this program. They're collecting information on cost, utilization, revenue, other service characteristics, and then they're going to evaluate the benefit that these services bring to the patient, how that applies and how that fits in with Medicare Part B's ambulance fee schedule, and attempt to make a determination as to whether or not Medicare is fairly paying ground ambulance services for what they are providing. The part of that is the benefit they are providing. So we, as Peterborough Fire and Rescue, feel that we are really well equipped to handle this when it comes to us. We're not in either one of the test groups for this, but when they roll this out, examples being, our relationship with Mid-Atlantic Community Hospital, with Concord Hospital, with Catholic Medical Center, in terms of bringing patients to the most appropriate facility for their treatment. So if you were having a heart attack and you need to go to a cath lab, we'll bring you to Concord or to Catholic Medical Center. If you're having some other complex medical problem that can't be cared for at Mid-Atlantic Community Hospital, or even if you have that complex medical problem where you need immediate hospital intervention, we do bring you to Mid-Atlantic, knowing you'll be transferred out in the future. These are things that are already part of what we do for patient care. So we think we're in a pretty good position to manage that. The second part of this, or the second thing that's coming up, is what is called the No Surprises Act. And that came out of a large program in 2020 where they really started looking at medical bills in whole. And the intent of it, and it was a good intent, was to protect patients from these surprise, out-of-network hospital charges. So a lot of us have seen them or heard of them where you go to your doctor, you find out that the hospital is in the network, the surgeon is in the network, you have your work done, and all of a sudden you get this huge bill from the anesthesiologist who wasn't part of the network, that you were not aware of, you didn't know was coming. So part of this is going through requiring pretty complex arbitration with your insurance company. The patient is not responsible for that difference if they can't come to an agreement. It currently applies to air ambulances, but they are looking to apply it to ground ambulances. There's establishment of a committee. The committee has to be formed. They have 6 months to look at it. And the goal of this committee that came out of the act is to develop options, best practices for individual communities, steps that can be taken by state legislatures, state insurance regulators, attorney generals, and other officials, as well as the need for any federal legislation to really prevent balanced billing of patients. So when you look at next slide here, when you look at where this is and what sort of does it mean for us, reimbursements are continuing to decline. Our patients have less resources to cover their share of the bill. One of the things that Dennis was quick to point out, looking at this from a historical perspective, as the economy has downturns, so do people's ability to pay their medical bills. Because quite often people, if they're without income, if they have income, quite often a lot of folks are relying on savings to pay their medical bills. Well, when you're not working, your savings is going to your day-to-day expenses. So really, you're in a position where expenses cannot be reduced, cannot be met by those folks. Us as an ambulance service, we are really in a position now where we have, over the last few years, really looked at our expenses and gotten our expenses to a position where they are at the minimum or sort of at the level that they need to be to bring in that level of service that we provide. We are not in a position to, looking at our current model with insurance reimbursement, reduce our expenses and continue to deliver the level of service that we deliver that is really providing a benefit to our communities and to everybody here. So I guess at this point, what I'll do before we transition into Leo's presentation is ask if folks have any questions about what I have presented in my part here before Leo really dives into the nuts and the bolts of the finance part of that.
Excuse me, Chief, you said early on in the presentation that there was some legislation forthcoming. Was that something you expect to be affecting favorably or unfavorably?
Unfavorably. That's a surprise act billing we have. In New Hampshire, we do not have the ability to say to a patient, you really don't need to go to the hospital. We're not going to take you because we don't think your insurance company will cover this. We are prohibited from having that conversation with the patient. So if somebody wants to go to the hospital, even though we don't think their insurance company or we know their insurance company won't cover this, we don't have the ability to say no, which is good from a patient perspective in that if they need to be seen or cared for, and the only way they can get there is the ambulance, they're guaranteed that ride. But from a revenue perspective or a reimbursement perspective, for us, that is very challenging.
So is that state legislation or federal?
It's federal. So that's coming down through federal legislature, and they're looking at that. There already are limitations on our ability to balance bill. As I mentioned, Medicaid, is capped at about $140 to $200 a call. We are prohibited from billing the patient the balance of that. Other insurers do allow us to bill that balance, do allow us to bill up to a deductible. Even Medicaid allows us to bill up to the patient's deductible. Medicare does, Medicaid does not.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I think we're all set.
Ed had his hand up.
Go ahead.
He's muted.
Well, if I understood it all, it sounds like a bleak picture ahead, that we're gonna have to do something to figure out how we're gonna continue to do this and pay for it. Am I right? Is that what I heard?
That is exactly what you heard. And I think that if you go back to that little bar graph I showed, in terms of revenues and expenses, we're doing a pretty good, we believe, and we've worked really hard with administration, in the almost 7 years I've been here now, and with finance to get to a point where we have a good grasp and understanding of not only our expenses, but also of our revenue cycle, and understanding how that revenue comes in. And that's what Leo's going to delve down into. And Leo's going to, I'll turn over to Leo at this point, and he will sort of go through and split. I think see Ronnie's hand up too.
Just a quick administrative question. I looked under tab 12 for ambulance in my binder, and I find that it's empty.
You should have gotten it in an email that we sent out, I believe, last Friday.
Thank you.
They were PDFs, yeah.
That explains it.
For all the changes that we made to the general fund, but the ambulance fund was in there too. The worksheet was dated 1/28.
Okay, thank you. My bad.
Okay.
I'm bad too, because I didn't get it.
Nicole, can I ask you a quick question? When we get to the FY22 budget, would you be able to put that up on the screen?
Yes, I could put that
From
up.
Teams, it's
Yep.
in Teams, yeah.
Yep.
And it's a version.
I'm probably the only one that got it because Shannon Bales any updates to me, and today I got that ambulance one, and I didn't know where it went. I said, geez, I don't see an old ambulance one in there. So now that answered that question.
Yeah, there wasn't one. That was the first look you guys had. So anyone who needs those printed out, just please let us know.
Me down.
How about this? Send an email. I'm not gonna take hands, but send us an email and we'll get this done.
I got it, Leo. Just out.
Okay, cool.
All right, I'll throw Leo's presentation up here.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to discuss tonight the historical summary of financials and projections. And what the presentation is about is to review the audit results of FY16 through FY20, review actual results through 1/31/21, review FY21 yearly projections, review the FY22 budget, and discuss fund balance options. So if we can, now we have the spreadsheet. Okay, so let me spend a few minutes before I get into some of the detail on this. The spreadsheet is set up so that we can kind of take a look at the historical aspect of the ambulance revolving fund from FY16 to FY20. These are all audited results. And tried to keep it simple. We're going to focus, the spreadsheet focuses on total revenues, total operating expenses, operating results of surplus, capital outlay, any other financing sources, and any surplus or deficit that might happen during the course of a particular year. And the fund balance is a cumulative number that moves based upon the results of the individual year surplus or deficit. Then we're going to talk a little bit about FY21, where we are now, and then projections. So I think one of the things that just had some comments that I wanted to talk about the ambulance fund is that when you look at it, the ambulance fund was a consistent and stable business during the periods of FY16 through FY19. And you can see when you look at the operating results surpluses, they were all in the plus. They were all in the plus before capital outlay. So it was a good, consistent business. And in fact, one of the things that Ed talked about, in the way the fiscal year is set up, that in FY19, you can see the large increase in the expenses. A lot of that was related to creating more of a full-time staff model to meet the needs of what the business, where the business was at that point in time. So just kind of looking at it, we can see that the revenues increased from 1.4 million in 2016 to 1.7 million in 2019, or 17%. The average revenues for this period were 1.5 million. The increase in revenues can be attributed to growth in allocations of fees to other towns and charges for services for the ambulance and transfer segments of the fund. Operating expenses increased from 1.3 million in 2016 to 1.6 million in 2019, or 29%. The growth is primarily related to staffing levels. Staffing levels costs are approximately 73% of the total operating expenses. This growth was driven by the need to meet the demands of the community for both ambulance and transfers. And during this period of time, the fund balance grew $118,000 to $574,000, or 26%. In each year, there was an operating surplus before any capital outlay expenditures. So just to recap, as it relates to that, it has been a consistent and stable business during those periods of FY16 to FY19. Then came COVID-19, beginning in FY20. Revenues decreased from FY19 by $223,000, or 13.2%. Operating expenses increased $58,000, or 3.6%. The ability to reduce expenses, considering the fact that staff costs make up 73% of the total cost, is very, very difficult, because it would have a negative impact on whatever revenue levels we did have. A combination of both of these issues created a $204,000 operating deficit. In addition, the capital outlay for ambulance equipment of $151,000 and the purchase of a new ambulance for $294,000, for a total of $445,000, created additional deficit for the fund. The overall impact of the above created a total deficit of $656,000 for the fiscal year. That in turn reduced the cumulative fund balance from a surplus of $574,000 to a deficit of $82,000. Pretty dramatic shift in terms of where we have been in the past, because of the impact of COVID. Had a real significant impact on the revolving fund.
trend with COVID-19, should we have made that $295,000 ambulance purchase this year, or could that have waited?
That decision was made before COVID hit.
We had already purchased the ambulance, Tyler.
If,
That was made at the May town meeting in May of 19,
Right.
which was the start of fiscal 20.
the thing is if you look at the operating results surplus line, and you could, as I mentioned, if we had a negative 264 deficit. You look at the previous year, it was 76,807. The difference between the two is 281,000. The fund balance, with the support of the general fund, could have, as we looked at the numbers before doing that, could easily have afforded that ambulance at that time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Now we're dealing with a negative fund balance of 655,000 from the year FY20.
No, that's the change. That's the net change that happened between 19 to 20. So we were 573,506. We lost 655,854, which pushed fund balance to a negative of 82,348. So we basically lost all the fund balance we had built up.
No new ambulances.
To say the least, Roland.
I have a question.
Sure.
In fiscal year 2020,
Yeah.
if we look at the 82,348, that
Yeah.
obviously has gone south,
Yep.
but where did that revenue come from?
The revenue came from the user fees, the same place it's always come from, as well as the other towns that we billed for the 911 service. So between the two things, that's where most of the revenue comes from. We did receive a very small, approximately $25,000 grant from Medicare to help cover some of the cost of transporting patients with COVID-19. But that was it. That was all the money that we were able to get out of the CARES Act. Unfortunately, the CARES Act legislation included wording that forbade the use of the CARES Act funds to offset loss of revenues incurred by states and municipalities. So it really, unfortunately, the exception of that $25,000, we weren't able to recoup any of those losses.
So is there any hope that we can collect from the federal government for these losses that we incurred because of COVID?
Well, we honestly don't know. There is legislation that's been introduced by the Biden administration that does include some language for funding to go to states and municipal governments that have lost revenues. And this is a very quick read of what was out there last night of the Republicans' counterproposal, did not include any of that funding. They were looking to really trim it down and try to just focus on poor, lower income families and other things like vaccine distribution, that sort of thing, which of course we're not part of. So it's going to be months anyways, probably until we would even see a final act, let alone money coming to the state, through the state to us. So I don't think. I'm sorry.
As I understand, though, Biden is pushing to get this $1.9 trillion pushed through early. I think this is why he's attacked this. Met with the Republican delegation yesterday. Well, the delegation just seems to say, well, okay, we want what we want, you want what you want. There's a way of that passing, but I'm not sure what's going to happen.
I absolutely agree. Something is going to come out of Congress and is going to get signed by the president. I don't know if what comes out of Congress and gets signed by the president is going to include dollars that will go to help support the ambulance service.
Well, this is absolutely a good explanation of what's going on as far as the COVID costs are concerned to the town of Peterborough.
Yes.
I think I'm reading this correctly, as it were.
Yeah, sorry, Carl?
Thank you. I don't quite understand why we're attributing so much of this to COVID, because it appears that something like 200,000 is due to change in revenue, but most of it is due to capital outlays, 656,000. Now, the decline in revenue that we saw earlier was due to reduced use of the transfers. So, did the reduced use during those several months, I would think there would be more transfers. Why is it the reduced use attributed to COVID?
It was actually on both sides. So you had to reduce transfers. There were still transfers. There were still some 911 calls. There was a very significant drop off though on both sides of the service. The reduced 911 calls and reduced transfers are sometimes linked. So you'll sometimes have a car accident, which is a 911 call, which involves a transport to the hospital, and then involves a transfer out of Monadnock Community Hospital to another hospital. So sometimes those calls are linked.
But look at that graph. That shows it mostly due to transfers.
Yes. Yeah. There was also a period. I'm sorry. I was going to say there's also a period when the hospital was not receiving patients,
That would explain. That would link it then to COVID. If the hospital's changing its access, then it doesn't do transfers, and that's the COVID link. Is that what I'm understanding?
Right. So there's a couple things in there. So yes, someone needs to go to Monadnock before they get transferred out. So if you look at the reduction we had in our 911 calls, that same reduction in 911 calls was felt by Sauhegan Valley, Jaffrey Range, Antrim, and Wilton, who also feed, if you will, or supply patients to Monadnock Community Hospital. So everybody went in. People were not going to the hospital. They were not, this stuff was not being done. And the other side of that too is, and again, it's lost in this, and I apologize, I didn't really articulate it. Although the transfer service is about 40% of our call volume, it's about 60% of our revenue. Because the transfers that go out, they are far more likely to be at an advanced life support level, ALS 1 or an ALS 2. There's also, they go further, and the distance it's a longer distance, so there's a higher reimbursement for that. Did I just lose my screen share?
Yes, I took it away.
All right.
I wanted to make sure that everyone can see who was talking. I wasn't entirely sure.
Okay.
Well, I guess we're back to more questions. Anybody have any different questions, other questions?
Yeah, I do. I have a question.
Rich? Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. When we first started this revolving fund, it was supposed to be self-supporting. That was the whole goal of it. And then I think it was 2019, the call volume had gone up, so that's why we purchased and got more personnel and more equipment. So my question is, does he think the call volume will go back up? And they're also saying that the revenue is going to continue to go down. So where does that leave us? I mean, do we just start continually put more money in it to provide more services for the towns? Are the other towns going to supply the money, or are they just going to start pulling out? Or are we going to be left with all the ambulances and the paramedics that we'll have to cover? That's my question.
So just a little bit of history. Although this fund, the fund that was started 3 years ago now, was really a change of fund. The ambulance has been self-supported through a revolving fund since its inception. So when you look at that history of that, and the goal to have the ambulance as a self-funded entity goes back 2 decades. And if you look at that chart, the one chart we have would show the 2011, where we were receiving about 45 cents on the dollar for everything we billed out, down to the 37 cents or so a dollar now. That was at some point, the belief or the assumption was that we continue to receive reimbursements at that rate. We have not. So, part of that, the desire to have a self-funded service was based upon the models that everybody really anticipated being in place then, private insurers paying whatever you send them a bill for. And, you probably look at the same thing, with yourself. I mean, you go to do a remodel on somebody who's had water damage or fire damage, and, you're fighting with insurance companies over, using 12 penny or 10 penny nails because there's a difference in cost. And we're facing a lot of the same thing with the ambulance services. So unfortunately, it's a whole bunch of things. I think one of the problems, and I've said this across a lot of different areas, what COVID did was COVID exposed or sort of catapulted forward a lot of things that were already in process. And, I know internally within administration, Nicole and Leo, when Leo first started coming on board to help with a lot of these things as we transitioned from Pam to Rodney, he had a glazed look on his face, and we talked about, revenues that we can't accurately predict and expenses that we know we're going to have whether we have revenues or not. And as we started going through some of that, it was difficult. As for towns leaving us, the communities that we do service for, when you look at the 5 towns that we serve, they represent about 25% of our total call volume. They're a little under half of our 911 call volume, and again, they're about 25% of our total call volume. So even if those towns were to leave, it wouldn't be a significant change in staffing. What it would really mean is we would go probably from 4 ambulances down to 3. Because, our current model really requires 3 ambulances to be on the road, and the 4th one guarantees that 3rd. That's probably where you would see that difference. So there would be a change in time over capital, because we pull that out of those costs. But for the rest of it, the model really doesn't have a significant, or wouldn't see a significant decrease in that. So I think that where we are now, and part of this explanation, I apologize for stealing the stage, is really to help sort of set up an understanding of where that is and how that fits in. If you look at the model that we have and the way we build those other towns, Peterborough's been very fortunate to have the revenue that we have from our transfer side of that, which is direct ambulance revenue, to help offset some of that allocated cost or that deficiency for our residents on that 911 side. I mean, I know Leo gets into that a little more when we get in there.
I understand that, but I'm just saying if it's in the future, if you're saying that the transfers are not going to be reimbursed, why are we doing transfers?
Well, the transfers continue to be. The transfer is primarily the 911s we're running into more of a problem. The transfers are, because again, that's all part of the billing. It's really the 911. The deficit in the service, although we run sort of one budget, they're run as 2 operations. The deficit within the 911 side of that is what continues to grow. And that's due to,
I was just curious. I thought it was the transfers, and I'm like, why are we continuing?
Yeah, no, it's
okay.
Yeah. All right, I'm sorry.
In fact, the transfer is actually what pays for the bulk of Peterborough's share of the cost. So we do receive significant revenue from the transfer service, and it's been a real benefit. It's really helped the whole ambulance service.
Well, I was just seeing the Medicaid, they weren't keeping up with the cost of each transfer. I figured that was for the transfers, not for the 911.
Right, it's, transport versus transfers. Okay. Transfers is the interfacilities, and transport is just any pickup.
Okay.
Let me just add an optimistic note here, Rich. Apparently, the problem we had with the returns to our transfer business was a temporary thing in the middle of the year. And as hospitals are getting back to their normal business, the business of the transfers is picking up.
That is correct.
Yeah, all of it's picking back up. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons we sort of did that expanded view of that 18-month period to show where it is, and it is back to sort of where it was.
Okay, Okay, so we've really outlined, what the ambulance service is, how it's earning its income, where its expenses are going, largely to staffing. Some of the other income that we get from the other communities, how most of Peterborough's share of the cost is reliant on the transfer service. Leo did a great job putting together a chart that showed in a regular year we have enough income to cover our expenses and to even have a bit of a surplus left over. And so much so that we were able to pay for the entire cost of an ambulance, or we projected to be able to pay the entire cost of an ambulance using the fund balance. What we did in 2019 is we had a warrant article for the lease purchase of an ambulance. Once that warrant article passed town meeting, what we did, rather than going to a leasing company to put out a lease for the ambulance, we actually self-leased it. The select board, Leo brought a proposal to the select board, and the select board agreed that the town of Peterborough would buy the ambulance, and then the ambulance service would reimburse the town of Peterborough. Essentially, we leased it ourselves. Another thing, we expected that would happen last year, and that's why you see that debt on the books. That debt is still a debt to the general fund of the town of Peterborough. It is not a debt to a leasing company. So there's a couple of things that we can do that we think are going to help us get through this trouble period. One, we'd like to ask the select board if we can defer the repayment of that ambulance to FY23. That'll give the ambulance service a chance to recoup some of its fund balance. Another thing that we'd like to consider as an option is to put a warrant article to raise and appropriate money to go into the ambulance services fund balance. That raise and appropriation could come from taxation. It could also potentially come as a transfer from fund balance from the town of Peterborough's general fund balance. If we do that, we want to wait a bit towards the end of the year, as we get a little bit further into springtime to figure out exactly how much that would be, because we want to make sure that there's plenty of money in the general fund. But that's what we're looking at as being some solutions to this deficit in the ambulance service fund. Because obviously the ambulance service needs to have cash in it to be able to run its regular operations. Anyone have any questions or comments on that?
Well, since you mentioned the select board, I'm totally fine with both of those options from the town's perspective, myself. If the revenues rebound like we're hoping that they do, then how much of a problem do we have going forward that we should be addressing?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the issues that we have is really a self-made issue, because we've worked very hard to keep as much of the cost of the ambulance service as possible off of the taxpayers. We have a very small line in the fire department budget for the tax support, the town of Peterborough's tax support of the ambulance service. It's a lot less than what we proportionally should be raising or would be raising by taxation if we needed to fund, if that's how we needed to fund our share of the deficit. If we were to, if this was us hiring an ambulance service, an outside ambulance service, we'd be looking at a much different funding scenario. We'd be looking at much higher taxpayer portion or taxpayer support of the program. So that's something that I think that we need to talk about, but not necessarily tonight. I think that if we can get this cushion into place, if we can agree that this is a good warrant article to put forward, if we can agree that pushing out the reimbursement of the purchase of the ambulance is a good thing to move out, and to essentially trust the ambulance service to be able to make those payments back to the general fund in the future, that's going to give us a bit of breathing room so we can figure out what, if any, changes we need to make in future years.
Do you want to spell that out in a motion?
I don't think we need a motion tonight, per se. I think we need a little bit more time, because like I said, go ahead, Leo.
Well, no, one of the things, as it relates to the lease payable that the fund has. I mean, one of the things is that the select board, and that's in my slide as it relates to fund balance options. But one of the things would be, would the town want to, the select board want to consider forgiving the loan? Because that would increase the fund balance. It would decrease the fund balance in the general fund, obviously, but it would increase the fund balance in the ambulance fund.
There are a couple questions that I have that need to be answered about that first, though. I would need to talk to town attorney to make sure that that's something that the select board could act on themselves.
Yeah.
But as far as putting warrant articles together, or even pushing out the payment, that is a select board action. That's something that you could do by vote.
Nicole, I have a question and I want to ask. It seems to me that every town that we serve pays a fee that is reimbursed in taxes.
Yes.
The town of Peterborough raises no tax money to support the ambulance fund. How does that seem proper to these other towns that are paying, plus we get the revenues from those calls? Yet the taxpayers of Peterborough pay nothing for their ambulance service. It's all paid for through fees.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it behoove us to think something about not only in fairness but to support this? Looks to me like a problem that's going to continue at least a short while if the insurance companies and the Medicare and Medicaid continue their what they're doing right now. How are we ever going to at any time get out of this without adding some money to the ambulance fund? It just makes sense to me that there should be an assessed tax amount going to the ambulance fund to support that. Yes, Ronnie?
We talked about a warrant article. What would be the ballpark figure of what we would be asking for ambulance in that warrant article?
Conservatively, we'd be looking at $500,000.
That's a one-time thing, though. What I was talking about would be it would be something we would do on a regular basis, year after year.
Yes, you're correct.
We could give them $500,000 this year, and we'd put them right back where they were last year. But is that fair to the taxpayers of Peterborough to bite that bullet all at one time and then say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, and find out 2 years from now we're going to do the same thing? I think it just makes sense to me that we should take a good overall look at this budget and say, what does the town need to do in order to correct this situation? Do they need to bail out with $500,000, or do they need to work at this in a way that makes the ambulance fund not run on deficits every year?
So we haven't run on deficits every year. It's really just been this past year because of COVID-19. We have had a surplus of, just in that chart that Leo showed, of at least $86,000 each year. So just since that chart began, which is 2016, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, but yes, that conversation certainly has been coming. That's something that, like Chief Walker just said, we've been talking about internally, and also, with some preliminary discussions with the board, that this is a conversation that we need to have. These reimbursements have been dropping by comparison to our expenses year over year for the last number of years. We didn't see that changing anytime soon, so this is certainly a conversation we were going to need to have. And in fact, we're more or less planning to start having seriously this summer. But then COVID happened, and that really pushed it to the next level and put us to where we are now, trying to figure out how do we fill this hole. Tyler?
So we're considering possibly using $500,000 of the general fund balance, and also either a forgiveness or a stay in the payments to the $300,000 lease.
It's a $200,000.
200. So we're looking at almost $700,000-ish. My question is, well, maybe a few questions. How much is in the fund balance? how much did we use to offset our tax rate just recently to make up for what we were gonna get hit with the schools, but to try and level things off so our taxes didn't raise too much? And maybe lastly, is there a way, if we hold off on the $200,000 lease payments and we do $500,000, can that be reimbursable instead of just back to the general fund balance from the revenues, instead of the taxpayers paying, losing that from the fund balance?
So there's a lot of things, yeah.
Right,
go ahead, Leo.
three-part.
I'll try. One of the things Nicole and I were talking about today, before we get into, if we're looking at a warrant article, is it fund balance or tax appropriation? We want to make sure we have a good handle on what we're projecting the fund balance is going to be at the end of the fiscal year, because a lot of those transactions wouldn't happen until then in the first place. In terms of your other question on taxes, in the last 2 years, I believe it's been 1.5 million that we've taken out of the fund balance to reduce the tax rate. 900,000 and 800,000. And we had still, even after all that, still had a healthy fund balance. But to be conservative, I think it'd be a good idea to be able to come up with what a reasonable number we think it's going to be at the end of June. And then that would probably really kind of help us, make the appropriate decision in terms of how we would want to structure the 200,000 or the $500,000 and that kind of thing, depending upon where we think the fund balance is going to be.
And so, sorry, we've used 1.7-ish million? 1.5. So if we looked at 500, $500,000 for one part of one department, is that kind of out of line with the way we've been funding or paying for things in town? Or?
Well, this is a special situation. And I think that you have to take a step back and look at the ambulance service and how it is a part of this community. It's not just about it being a department, just like, everything we do, it's all in service of the residents of Peterborough, the businesses of Peterborough, the other services provided within Peterborough that are not necessarily governmental services. And the ambulance service plays an incredibly big role in all of that. I mean, if you step back and consider, the number of people who, are having whatever medical event, be it a heart attack or stroke or whatever other issues that can't be treated at MCH but need immediate assistance, they're being brought to hospitals by our ambulance service, by paramedics that are highly skilled and able to even provide some of that really top level care while they're on their way to the hospital. A lot of people move to Peterborough because of the high level of health care that we can provide here. And that's, again, no small part because we're able to bring them to where they need to go and very, very quickly. So it's really, it's not just about the service, it's about the whole philosophy of what we're providing. Could we go back to just having an on-call ambulance service? Yes, we could. But that could be incredibly detrimental to the entire community. So when we look at making this transfer, we're not making this transfer because, in my opinion, granted, I'm a bit biased about this because, of course, I've been, working with the ambulance service, working on the financials of it for 10 years now. And I think that we have run a very tight ship, but it's incredibly difficult. As you saw, those reimbursements have been dropping. As you saw, our expenses have been going up. And even though we've been able to break even every year and perhaps even have a bit of a surplus to put away, that surplus has been declining because of those factors. Then 2020 happened, and I don't need to tell you because you just saw it. We took a huge hit. And so that's where we are now. If this was just any year, and all of a sudden we turned around and realized that we had lost $250,000 in revenues in 1 year and went, oh gosh, I couldn't even show my face, to be perfectly honest. I would be beyond mortified by, having made such a grotesque error. But the fact of the matter is that we didn't see this coming. None of us saw this coming, and this couldn't have possibly happened at a worse time because we had just, prepared to make that outlay. So It's really circumstances that were very much beyond our control.
Billy wants to
Bill?
speak.
Yeah, so one thing to clarify is the last 2 years when we took fund balance money to pay down the tax rate for the next year, it was out of the fund balance for that particular year. It's money we didn't put into a savings account. It's not money that we took out of a savings account. We didn't dip into a savings account. We just didn't add it. Right.
Yeah, the fund balance is a cumulative number. You know,
Right.
It builds on itself or it decreases on itself based upon what happens in a fiscal year.
Right.
In the
And
last
so
couple
we
of,
can add to it.
years, we did a good job in terms of creating more fund balance based upon how we manage the town's budget, encumbrances, et cetera.
And not budgeting, and not paying for things that we budgeted but didn't use.
Right. So we still added to that fund balance over the last 2 years, even though we spent 1.7 to take money to pay down the tax rate. And the other thing is that I wanted to say was, right now, we don't have the information to make the decisions that we're talking about right now, right?
We don't have all of it. And it's not that we don't have the information, it's just we want to wait a little bit to see where we are. We don't have to make this decision tonight, but we wanted to start this conversation, and this was the appropriate time to do it with everyone here, because the more questions we get asked, the more comments we hear, the better we can think about the problem and really see more sides of it. So that's why we brought it up tonight, but no, we don't need an answer or a vote from the select board tonight. We don't need a vote of support from the budget committee tonight. I think we're going to get a little bit further, into February and perhaps beginning of March before we make, a decision about what we're recommending for town meeting.
Ronnie wants to speak.
So my question at this point would be, how do we segue into a discussion of the overall proposed budget, knowing that this is on the horizon? Talk to me about that.
Sure. Well, I think we just kind of cut over to the overall budget analysis. Because one way or the other, this is going to be a special warrant article. Whether it's moving money from one fund balance to the other or raising additional monies through taxation, it's going to be a special warrant article. So it's not going to have an impact on the operating budget that we've been reviewing for the last number of weeks.
And we also don't know if we might get some federal government money.
That's true, and that's one of the other reasons that we want to wait, because it could very well be that we're going to get some strong signs that we're going to have some money coming, and
Right.
we may be able to use those funds to reduce the ask,
Okay.
whether it's from the fund balance or from taxpayers.
So let's move on
Would you, before we move entirely out of ambulance revolving fund, would you like to take a look at the budgets that you may not have downloaded from your email yet? Okay, let me get that up for you.
By the way, the presentation that I put together here, I will make sure that it gets sent out to the select board and the budget committee.
Is that zoomed in enough for people?
Didn't you did send 2 emails that each had 6 attachments?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was talking about the presentation that we were reviewing tonight.
Gotcha.
I have that because I had some more information I was going to share about fiscal 21, only to the extent is that when we were talking about the potential for $500,000, I had projected that the cumulative fund balance at the end of FY 21 for the ambulance fund could be a negative $425,000. And I think you probably saw that on the spreadsheet. I know we didn't get into FY 21. We kind of jumped into FY 22. Anyway.
Chief, do you want to just give us kind of a tour? You're muted still.
I did that on purpose. So one of the things, again, I'll sort of say, start with the thank you to Leo and Shannon. We really spent a lot of time this year taking a look at our budget, and particularly those things within our budget that are shared across other town departments. Electricity, telephone, fuel, all those things that make up a big part of what we have for our services, and look at this. When you take a look at our budget, for budgeting purposes, we have two distinct divisions, if you will, and we talked about those previously. One is the 911 or the emergency side, and the other is the transfer side. So where you see ambulance operations, that refers to the 911 or emergency side of that. So we have, salaries, payroll, tax, unemployment, retirement, those sort of things in there. All of our full-time staff, the benefits for our full-time staff came out and come through here as that. And as we mentioned back in calendar year 18, which was fiscal 19, that was where we saw that large jump and that large increase. When it comes to operating the building that we're in here, we split those costs between the ambulance and the fire department. So when you see repair and maintenance of building, when you see ambulance buildings and grounds, that goes into the cost of operating this building. Ambulance vehicle equipment and maintenance, ambulance supplies, some of those are specific to the ambulance service itself. Deputy Chief Matt Robley has worked really well over the last couple of years, and even more so in the last year with COVID, in terms of nailing down specific places to source our equipment and the things that we need to have, and really optimizing both the delivery times for that as well as the cost for a lot of that stuff, as opposed to our previous approach, which really was the single source vendor for that, just the person we'd always use, we kept going back to. We've done a really good job with that. One thing to mention on the salaries, we did make a change for fiscal 21, which was carried over to fiscal 22. And then we have a number of our employees who are firefighters and EMS personnel, and again, the other ones aren't. So as we calculated the percentage of salaries to be paid out of our various budgets, the fire department budget now contributes, the tax-supported fire department budget now contributes only the salaries for those members that are also firefighters. So those folks that do not serve firefighting purposes or firefighting functions, in the community, are paid strictly out of that ambulance budget. So as you scroll down through now, we start to get into our transfer division and transfer operations. So a lot of those folks, a lot of those expenses there, diesel fuel, for example, reimbursement for mileage, some of the repair and maintenance on the ambulances, we split those based on the allocation of call volume. So the call volume allocation of the 60-40 that we have for ambulance 911 at the 60%, transfer service at the 40%, is how those things are allocated across and how we look at that. We have that done. I don't know, as we go down through, there aren't a lot of significant changes anywhere. I think what's the overall budget difference, Leo? I don't have it right in front of me. Do you have that as we get down to the bottom, percentage increase?
Yeah, the budget is being presented as being level funded, meaning that, but that's about in terms of the revenues, it's up 0.9% over FY21.
Yeah.
And we are looking at the increases, particularly in the ambulance service fees and the ambulance service fees or ambulance and transfers, based upon some recent discussions we had. And I think, Deb, you were talking about in Matt, that we're starting to see an uptick that potentially could, gets us back to where we were. The budget in terms of revenues is making an assumption that we will restore the revenue line.
Correct.
To FY19.
Yeah, and we believe that.
That's
again, looking at our last, 6-month trend of data and what's going on, as you mentioned, hospitals are starting to do more services, people are starting to move out and about in the community. We are starting to get up there.
I think, excuse me, sorry, I'm losing my voice. The presentation I prepared has all of the departments, all of the map, the reasons for increases, decreases, and that kind of thing. And so like I said, I will get that sent out tomorrow. It has all the detail for the budget.
Who's on?
It's a good question. Who's on?
I'm just trying to,
I have tons of detail if you want to go through it. But I know we kind of went it, just talking about the overall fund balance issues for the fund.
yeah, I'm just looking for the summary.
Nicole,
Yes.
I lost everything that you were talking about, the graph and everything. I was in some kind of garden thing and everything. I finally came back, so I have no idea what you were talking about.
I'm sorry. So we were just very, very quickly going over the ambulance revolving fund budget, which you do have in an email from Shannon or Leo. Leo sent it, okay. So you can look at that,
I
at your
don't have
leisure.
any, yeah,
Okay, well, Leo can resend it to you.
okay.
And if you need it printed out, just let us know and we'll print out those sheets for you.
I can print it out once again.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, Leo, I'm struggling to find the summary sheet in Teams.
You mean for the, okay, hang on for a second.
Yeah.
Let me, sorry, let me get.
Oh, I just found it.
Okay.
Here it is.
You'll see
Sorry.
four, I think 4 or 5 tabs.
Yeah, I just found it.
Yep.
I had the wrong spreadsheet open. Okay. Okay. Now you should all have this as well. This is just the top, very, very top level summary of the operating budget that we presented to you over these past few weeks. You can see that our operating budget is up 4.8%. For all the reasons that Leo's discussed, a lot of things were entirely out of our control, including the police pensions, health insurance costs and whatnot. But our operating budget CIP costs are down almost $127,000, or down 49.7%, and our debt service is also down 10.1%. So our total operating budget that we're looking for is up just 0.9%. So really, in our minds, an incredibly responsible budget. And I think that you've agreed too, as we've gone through it. Our total amount, when you look at the warrant articles that we currently have prepared for the warrant this year, those are also down 33.2%. And our total amount that we're looking to raise through taxation this year is down $221,462. So again, very responsible budget. I think that, all of our department directors have done an incredibly good job of taking a very close look at their costs, and their expenses and the things that they wanted to do this year, and just bringing in only what they absolutely needed. Leo and Shannon have done an incredible job pulling all this together, really staying on top of everything. I really cannot say how pleased I am with the work that they've done. This has just been absolutely tremendous. Happy to go through anything that you folks might have for outstanding questions on any of these budgets. Or if you want to take a look at the summary itself and go through that line by line, you can certainly do that. I'll turn that back to you, Mr. Chair.
I'll defer to any questions that we may have on it. It seems pretty straightforward what we've got here. Any questions from
Ronnie?
the committee?
The only question I have is where is this in the books we got?
I don't
So
think I
this is-
have, could we get this worksheet if we
Yeah,
pick up the ambulance sheets? Could this be included?
Yes.
It's in the package that was sent email.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, which I don't have yet.
Leo, can you run a package off for me? We'll pick it up. I have none of that stuff.
Okay.
I would just.
I think we're just gonna have to start sending stuff now.
Yeah.
Well, that email went to a group called the Budget Committee. Is
Yeah.
everybody on here in that group?
Nobody's on the group.
Went on Friday, so everybody should have it.
Yeah,
It might be the wrong budget committee, because I didn't get a few things because they were using the year before, not this year.
That was changed because we got your email address from, I got your email, Matt, excuse me. I got your email address, so we made that change.
Is it possible to pick the sheets up at the townhouse so you don't have to mail them?
yes,
Yes.
absolutely, we can do
Set them
that.
up like we did the budget books. You come into the town hall. I mean, whoever wants them, even whoever wants hard copy sheets printed out, send me an email,
Okay.
okay?
Will do.
All right. That'd be the best thing.
Okay. Nicole, you back on?
I am. Any questions from anybody?
The only question I have, it isn't about this, it's about a line item in the fire department. And I just think that 18,000 still should be the stipend and not the salary line. Because it isn't a salary that should go in the stipend line. That's my opinion, I don't know about the rest of the committee viewpoint.
Well, a stipend is payroll.
Well,
Get taxed, just like any other kind of wages.
So you're saying, Bob, that should be included in the salary line?
No, I say it shouldn't be in the salary line because we've had in the past the stipend line for other departments. And that money goes in there, not in the salary.
Are we changing the way things were? Nicole, is that?
I honestly don't recall how we've had the stipends budgeted in the past. It's been a long time and to be perfectly honest, an entirely different accounting system ago. So I'd have to dig back through some paper to see if I can figure it out. But, to me, it could go either way. It could be included in the salaries because, as you say, they are taxed, or as Leo says, they are taxed and treated just like income. For retirement system purposes, they're considered income. But, if it would make more sense to people to want to be able to explicitly see and control how that money is being spent, then having it in a separate line might make sense as well.
That's just my opinion, Nicole, is
Yep.
whatever they want.
I don't know if Chief Walker has a particular preference for how he'd like to manage that money. I guess I would defer to him. What would make the most sense to him?
Yeah, I mean, as the way this came out was looking at a way to try to incentivize our folks to respond into calls, going back to the fact that the department previously had a stipend program. So one of the things that we wanted to do was clearly show that this was the intention was to have this be budget neutral. So by leaving it in this, the idea of leaving it in the salary line item was that you'd be paying this out of our salaries and out of our existing salary money. And if, we were fortunate enough to have every member of the department respond to enough calls that they all received the stipend, what we would then do is take money and not do other, maybe decrease some trainings, decrease some meetings to make up that difference. So the goal with setting it up was to show that it was a budget neutral program as opposed to, hey, we're asking you for 18,000 additional dollars so that we can try to spend all the money we've always spent. We certainly can pull that out some other way, just understanding that if we don't give all of that money out in stipends, we probably will end up spending that dollar amount because we're going to continue to do the trainings, continue to do the meetings and the other things. So sort of That was the theory behind having that, or leaving that in the salaries, but
So, although it's not really all incentive, it could be spent for other things, is what you're saying there.
right, and then the goal was to create the program in a budget neutral fashion, which is how we came up with the dollar amount and why it was left in the salaries and why it's paid mid-year as opposed to at the end of our fiscal year.
Ronnie?
I have to say, in looking at the amount of money to be raised through taxation, compared to the prior year, it's down something like 2.8%. And boy, I applaud that. What I'm curious about is how will that translate to the taxes that people pay? In other words, might that be offset by an increase in the tax rate, or how does that play out? What are your projections? Are taxes that people pay will they go down because of this, or?
No, I unfortunately, I have a somewhat, we have, to be sure, the town, does play a significant role in as far as what your tax rate is and what money needs to be raised through taxation by the residents of Peterborough, the property owners of Peterborough. But it's a relatively small role compared to the school district. And if you've been reading, keeping up with the paper lately, you'll see that the school district is just as badly hurt by revenue loss this past year as our ambulance service has been. And it's going to have a very dramatic impact on taxation next fall. So are we going to save some money? Yes. Yes, we are. What we're asking to be raised through taxation is certainly less than it was last year, but I think that those savings are going to get swallowed up and quite a bit then some. And it's entirely out of the school district's control. They really don't, those revenue losses are beyond them. But how they deal with them, how they mitigate them, that's going to be something that we're all going to need to pay attention to.
I'd like to just share, I was at the meeting I attend as a select board member with the school, some school committee and the superintendent. And my impression of it was, first of all, that the superintendent, in my opinion, is doing just about everything. I don't know how she does it all, doing everything to try to control costs. But she announced last Thursday night at the meeting, when pressed by some of the other selectmen from the other towns, smaller towns particularly, that she has done everything she can do over the past 4 years, and there's only one thing left, and she said it loud and clear. The only thing left is to close schools. And, that's the only thing she's got left. And she warned of severe cuts that she's hearing about from the state. So it's one of the reasons that I think we have to be really careful about everything we do, because I believe we already had a pretty good increase in tax rate last year because of because of things, and I think we're in for it again, Ron. So that's, Ronnie, that's not a good answer you probably want to hear, but what we do in the town to save is, in my opinion, not gonna, it's very likely, unless some miracle happens, they're not gonna, and they have not been putting they've been putting money away in capital reserve, but they announced also that they had $20 million worth of maintenance that needs to be done on those buildings, and they might have to ask for a bond for $20 million in the not too distant future. So it's very gloomy what's going on, and maybe in a way it might be a blessing in disguise that she said what she did the other night. But the people in the district have to wake up and realize that we can't, we and I mean all the 9 towns, just can't afford to keep getting costs would reduce numbers of students. So anyway, that's, until we know that, we're not gonna know that until we get very close to having to set the next tax rate, what effect all of this is going to have on
The
that
answer
tax
to
rate.
Ronnie's, the answer to Ronnie's question is the portion that people's taxes go to the town will be going down by 2.8%.
And that's really all we can control at the end of the
Yeah,
day.
the town doesn't, we have no control whatsoever over the school budget except for our own individual votes at the polls, so.
The town portion of the budget, of the total tax dollar, 70 cents goes to the school, less than 30% because there's a county appropriation too. It's about 3 or 4%. So Peterborough does very well with the quarter that we get out of the tax dollar. So as you said, Ed, we gotta take a long, hard look at what the school's doing, and it's our share of the dollar is so minimal that people forget where the real price tag is hanging on us is right up the street here in Conval. And so I'm just kind of looking at it a little bit of how we saved 2%, and it's a drop in the bucket when it comes to the tax rate. So it figures out.
And are there any figures on what will be siphoned off public school funding through this voucher program that's being pushed through? Was it HB 30?
20, I think it's HB 20.
HB 20 is the most recent.
Nicole, do you have an answer to that?
I don't have an answer to that. I just know that that's what was being discussed at the Selectmen's Advisory Committee meeting last week, was the potential impact that bill may have, that and other bills. There has been a reduction in the average daily membership, which is the school's population, and that's the number that the state uses to determine how much revenues the schools get. So, school district is, the population's been dropping steadily, and I don't think COVID helped out at all.
Absolutely. Do you have anything else we want to cover tonight, Nicole?
No, that was really it. So if there aren't any more questions.
I have one, Nicole. You know how many warrant articles might be coming down to town meeting?
There are a couple petition articles I know that are still hanging out there. Let's see, we are looking at
Well, money-wise.
for money articles, obviously, you have Article 3, the budget. Let's see, we are looking at, Fire 1. Let's see, those can be combined, so it's 4. I'm looking at 4.
And how would that affect the budget if they all pass?
If they were to all pass,
Not knowing what they are, so.
You're looking at the budget we just discussed.
yeah.
On warrant articles?
Yeah, the warrant articles are down $280,000 from prior year. And
If all
so
the
our
warrant articles
overall,
pass.
if all warrant articles were to pass this year, we'd still be asking to raise less, 2.8% less than prior year, or $221,462 less than last year.
One other question, not to do with budget control. I keep getting these email Google Calendar for the Select Board and Budget Committee, Tuesday, February 2, 11 p.m. to Wednesday, February 3rd, at 12 a.m. And I have no idea what they are.
I have no idea what that
It's
is
on Google
either.
Calendar, and I have no idea what they are at the time, so I'm like,
That's
I
very
got in at
strange.
5:30 tonight. I'm like, what is this?
I don't know, Bob, I can't help you there.
Okay.
Do I hear a
Special,
motion
Bob.
to adjourn?
I adjourn. Motion.
It's moved and second. Second? All in favor?
Second.
Good night.
Right?
Good meeting tonight, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.